Hello listeners, from Roy Damari of INSAM, speaking to you on the day when Trump has fired the head of the FBI. A curious manoeuvre indeed. Now, I happen to be old enough to have lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts back in 1973 when I had just started a 2-year MBA program down the road from where I lived in Cambridge and across the river into Boston proper. And in October 1973, Richard Nixon managed to get himself heavily criticized by Congress, and eventually he was impeached. Now, one of the acts he did was to fire a chap called Archibald Cox, who was leading a special investigation into the Watergate break-in. And it was rather obvious, actually, that Nixon had fired Cox because he was getting too near the truth, that indeed the invasion of Watergate had been ordered by the president himself. Now, parallels have been drawn with Trump now firing James Comey as head of the FBI. And I have to say I'm quite impressed by the gentleness of James Comey in accepting that decision. Good for him. The motive given for the firing has to do with Clinton and the way in which Comey spoke and published about her using private emails for public business, including withdrawing the case just before the election. And many suppose that had an impact on the results and helped Trump come to power. So it's a bit odd that he should fire Comey for that reason, or rather that ostensible reason, because just about everybody thinks that the real reason is that Comey was heading an investigation into Russian influence on the presidential election, and there it is easy to understand that Trump would want the man out of the way who's leading the investigation. So that has a certain parallel with Nixon firing Archibald Cox all those years ago. But it's not in the same category of non-constitutionality or illegality, because no one is pretending that President Trump has actually done anything unconstitutional or illegal. It's just a matter of if somebody is under investigation, or shall we say a topic is under investigation, which inevitably involves the person in power, the person in power doesn't look too good if he then fires the person conducting the investigation. And I think actually Trump has made a huge mistake, which will turn many Republicans against his behavior, not just senators on the other side in the Democratic Party. So I think this story, which is only bursting as I make this recording, has a long way to run. It has one or two other odd things about it. There is a Senate panel, a bipartisan panel, which is demanding via subpoena the papers that Michael Flynn has so far declined to release. Remember, Flynn was sacked too, precisely because of interacting, and they're not fessing up the truth with the Russian ambassador to the United States. There is a call from the Democratic side, of course, to appoint an independent prosecutor or investigator. I think that is likely to come about yet, because as long as it's partisan, saber-rattling and mutual accusations, I don't think they're going to solve this problem of Russian interference in American democratic affairs. Well, in past broadcasts, I have used the noun antics to describe Trump's behaviour, and I have to say I think I chose my noun rather well. Let me now switch topics and come back to the issue of investments and allow me to comment on what is happening in the USA and in the world. There is apparently a degree of recovery taking place, but the recovery in the USA is more psychological. It's what we have called in previous broadcasts psychoeconomics, whereby, because of an announcement made by the administration, investors have felt that things are looking good, even though hard data do not point that way. And that, I fear, is what is happening in the USA, that the recovery is just as weak as ever it was, and that the upbeat in the stock markets is because of this Trump effect, which has to run out sometime when it is seen by all the investors that really nothing much is happening. Yes, the unemployment has gone down, but as usual it's gone down because of what used to be called disparagingly Mac jobs. And all the time I have these words from Harry Dent to the effect that he expects a major collapse in the stock market. Yes, I admit I've been repeating that from him for so long now that you must be slightly laughing at me, because you can always say it's going to rain. It will eventually rain, and I'm sure there will eventually be a decline, even a major decline or collapse of the stock market, but it hasn't happened yet. For many years, actually, not just months, I've been taking the view that in the reaction of our respective governments to the collapse of 2007-2008, after the subprime crisis, I've said that the approach in Europe is a more sound approach, in that it involves admitting that things went wrong and asking for belt tightening to clear the decks, as it were, and starting moving forward. And that approach has been greatly criticised because the Americans did not do any significant belt tightening. They merely lowered the cost of money and kept the economy ticking over. I have supposed that the solution in Europe is a better or more solidly based solution than that adopted in the United States, but that is a long-term view, and I cannot seriously point to results to say, well, I was right all along. Nevertheless, Europe is improving, and with the French election out of the way, there is every chance it will improve further. Of course, the euro has strengthened, but then, curiously enough, so has the pound, despite Brexit. And I will have to admit that the approach in the UK, which was kind of halfway between the US approach to dealing with the crisis and the Eurozone approach, I have to admit that has kind of worked in the UK, and one can maintain a degree of optimism without being absolutely sure they've got through it yet. So much now depends on the Brexit negotiations. And for that, we now have a row going on between Prime Minister May and people in Brussels. There has been an unusual development in the bond market, in particular in the American Treasury bond market, because when people invest in longish term bonds, at least 2 years, but probably more like 10 years, they are interested in locking in a decent yield, and they have typically gone to the bonds of very well-heeled companies, which traditionally have offered a somewhat higher interest rate or yield to maturity than US Treasury bonds. And that has reversed in this last week or two. Right now, you can actually earn more money buying a Treasury bond for 2, 3, or up to 10 years than you can in buying a high-class corporate bond. That is very, very unusual. And the recommendation from some people would be that you could put some of your savings and investments into medium or long-term treasury bonds, which are, of course, in dollars. And I would certainly not be against anybody investing in dollars. I would be against them investing all their wealth in dollars. But since we never quite know whither currency exchange rates go, I think that to have some dollars is not a bad idea, and it does at least earn something, whereas the very safe government bonds in Europe, particularly in Germany or in Swiss francs, in Switzerland, they actually have negative interest rates, so they are really just not worth having at all. You're better off just having a current account in the bank and hoping they don't actually charge you too much for it, or of course you can keep your money under the bed. I guess I am a fairly conservative investor and advisor. I think that it is not the time to look for fantastic returns unless you're a very active trading type person who invests, and that's not my style either. For long-term investments now, safety is the best idea, and I think that high-class Swiss bonds and shares are just great. And if you do tinker with the American market, I have to say for shares, be very careful, and maybe you should be taking some professional advice, not from me, but for some really up-to-date professional advisor. Well, I'll speak to you again next week, when actually I'll be heading off to Germany for a conference on something we call lay reading, or lay readers. So I'll again make my recording on the Thursday so that it can go out properly on the Sunday. On the Sunday, speak to you again.